Hello, Tom. Thank you for being here today. We get a lot of comments on YouTube on various videos that you've done, and one particular one was with Bernardo Kastrup. I thought it was a great video, and one of the comments was that they thought that you conflicted with Bernardo's philosophy about time. Now, I know in your theory, consciousness, free will, and time needs to go together. And in some other theories, and it's a carryover from a materialist um, kind of philosophy about time or thought about time, it's a little bit different, yours. Can you explain how it's logical that time goes with consciousness and free will, and kind of your interpretation of time,
Well,
and
well,
why Bernardo would have a, a problem with your definition of it?
well, sure. One thing first that I will tell the listener to this, I did a video with you some time ago called "It's About Time." Very clever little title to it because it was all about time, and it's about time. So those of you who really want to get more depth of this issue of time and what is it and where does it come from, go look up "It's About Time" on my YouTube channel and look at that, because that's probably us discussing time for a half hour, 45 minutes. And this is just going to be a lot shorter than that. This is just a little snippet about that particular thing. So please go there. The connection between time and free will and consciousness is that all three of those need to logically exist for any of them to exist. In other words, they're logically necessary for each other. It's like this. Let's start with consciousness. If we just start with the idea that consciousness exists, then we can say that consciousness is an information system, and what consciousness does is it creates information. Okay, and it communicates that information it creates with another consciousness. This is what consciousness is. It's an information system that communicates. Or we could just say it's an information system that chooses what it wants to receive or what it wants to send, and how it interprets what it receives. We could maybe put it that way. Well, if we have that, then that tells us that we have to have change. Things have to change. Before I got the information, after I got the information. Before I send something out, after I send something out. The fact that consciousness is interactive, right? It's not just a thing that's a one thing and it doesn't ever do anything or ever interact with anything. Consciousness is an interactive thing. Okay, for something to be interactive, there has to be change before and after the interaction. Interaction itself means change. Well, if there's change, then there has to be time, because before the change and after the change. So you can't have a consciousness that actually does something, that communicates, thinks, is aware of what? It's aware of this now, and now it's aware of that afterwards. Its awareness isn't just static. If everything isn't static, and if you think of a static consciousness, well, it's not consciousness anymore. It's just something static isn't conscious. So if you have consciousness, you have to have time. And if you have choice, now the consciousness has choice. It chooses to do things. It's not just randomly creating random information, because randomness isn't information. Randomness is order. So to create order requires choice. What order? What sort of order? How am I going to create that order? There has to be choice involved. Otherwise, consciousness would just be random. And then there would be no order, and then there would be no consciousness. Because without any order, then there's no interaction. Interaction requires some order. There's interaction. There has to be purpose there as well for that. All right. Now, if you're an information system, that purpose is to create information, and that is to lower the entropy of the system. Entropy is disorder. Everything's random. Lower entropy, you decrease entropy, and now you have everything's not random. Some things are are not random. They're on purpose. They're there. They're a choice. Okay. So given we're conscious, and given that consciousness makes choices, then you also have to have free will, because without free will, there is no choice. Free will says that you can choose between this or that. You have two choices. I can communicate this or communicate that. I can interpret information this way or that way. You have choice. Consciousness, in order to exist, has to have choice. A consciousness without choice is not a consciousness. You see, a consciousness without time, that it can't, nothing can change, is not a consciousness. Okay. Choice not only requires time before the choice and after the choice, but choice requires free will. Without a free will, there is no choice. You see, that's the definition of no free will, is no choice. You can't say, well, I have choices, but I don't have free will. That's a logical conflict. It's not that way. Free will means that you can make choices. Your will is free to make a choice. When you have determinism, you don't have free will because there are no choices. You don't have time because there are no changes. Therefore, you don't have consciousness either, because there's no time and there's no choice. So consciousness then is undefined. If there's no time and no choice, then you can't define consciousness. It's not anything. Because if it's even if you just define it as awareness, well, aware of what? It's aware of this. Well, is it also, can it be aware of that? If it's only aware of this and that's it, nothing ever changes, the consciousness is just aware of this, well, that's not really consciousness. That's something else. Consciousness has to be able to focus that awareness on this or that. That's what makes it consciousness. So I don't have some stylized, limited definition of consciousness. I have my definition of consciousness. It's the real thing. It's conscious. It's what we experience, right? This is the consciousness I'm working with, not some sterile consciousness is just an awareness of one thing and nothing else ever. To me, that's not consciousness. So if you can say, well, that's just consciousness, but it's a limited consciousness that never does anything. It just exists, but never acts, never interacts, never does anything. Then my definition of consciousness, that's not really consciousness. That's some sterile definition of consciousness in order to create a failure of consciousness existing. So anyway, that's what time, consciousness, and choice, free will, have to do with each other. They're all necessary. You can't have one without the other.
Well, that gives us purpose. That gives us purpose to our life. That
gives us purpose. You need purpose, because how else are you going to make choices? If you have no purpose, all your choices are random. Random choices don't go anywhere. They don't build anything. They don't create anything. They don't amount to anything. So you have to have purpose.
And if we're determinism, we're just robots with there's no point to existence.
Not even robots. There's no existence. No. You see, determinism, there is no choice, there is no consciousness, and there is no free will. All those things are logically incompatible with determinism. So determinism, what is determinism? What is there? There's nothing. Determinism is nothing that persists, or a thing that persists but never changes. Okay, so it's
a dead end.
Not,
determinism and materialism.
It doesn't go anywhere. End. Right.
So
it's entirely a dead end. Right. It doesn't have, it doesn't have a beginning. It doesn't have an end. It doesn't have anything. It's just the null set of possibilities. Nothing happens. Nothing can happen. Nothing will happen. Nothing changes. There's no growth. There's no evolution. There's no learning. There's nothing, you see. So
well, I will say Bernardo has a book out called Materialism is Baloney. So he's definitely on your side of philosophy and idealism. Mm-hmm. But I think what people are missing is that if it's determinism and materialism, there is no adding consciousness into that mix by some other means, which you see a lot of that happening.
It is logically, from my viewpoint, in how I define time, consciousness, and choice, and free will, my definitions of those things, then they're completely incompatible with determinism. Materialism requires determinism. Okay, materialism sees the world as like a big machine. It's based on rules. And just like a big machine is based on rules, you have this input, you get that output. You have this force, you get that motion, and everything can be calculated. And if you had a description of every piece of matter in the world and its state vector, that means the forces on it and what its state is, if it's moving or whatever, then you could predict everything else that could happen, because you just apply the rules and it predicts everything. So that means you have determinism. Everything's determined. It's just that we're not smart enough to know what it is determined. So it seems like it's not determined to us, but it really is. Everything is pre-done. But of course, that is silly in the sense that it doesn't fit our experience at all. It's completely counter to our experience, but it's necessary for materialism. So now you have a bunch of scientists and they're all materialists. That means they have to logically be determinists, or they're logically inconsistent. So now they have this problem in the world. They see consciousness, they see time, they see motion, they see people making choices, they see consciousness, but they have to deny all of that because logically, none of that can exist, because materialism is based on determinism, and determinism vanishes everything. Nothing happens. Nobody ever learns. Nothing ever changes. So now you have a bunch of scientists who say, we have to get rid of consciousness, time, and free will. Otherwise, we're logically inconsistent. So they have to make up a story. And they say that time, free will, and consciousness are all illusions. You just think that they happen. And I mentioned this to Bernardo when we had that talk. I told him these two sets of things are incompatible. Materialism and determinism is incompatible with consciousness, time, and free will. And he had a problem with that. And I kind of said, well, if you have determinism, then you can't have those other things. Consciousness needs time and it needs free will. If no free will, there's no choice. No choice, then there's nothing for consciousness to do. To say just consciousness is a thing that doesn't actually do anything, well, then consciousness doesn't exist. It's not really there. Consciousness is a real thing. It's aware. It makes choices. It needs change and time and free will. So the problem is that he has evidently come across, like a lot of people, the physics, the scientists who are logically pressed into saying that time, consciousness, and free will are all illusions. Otherwise, they're not being logical. And the way they justify that is by saying, and time is where we disagreed. I gave him a definition of free will, and he thought that was consistent, logically consistent with my model, but it wasn't really the definition that he had of free will, or the definition that most people have of free will. And I think most people's definition of free will is a free will that the scientists made up just so they could say that it didn't work. Basically their idea of free will, that free will is a genie that gives you anything you want. And Bernardo made the point. He says, well, if I had free will, I'd be, what did he say, rich and famous and in a cell someplace where nobody could bother me, right? Where nobody could interrupt me or bother me. But that's not free will. Free will isn't a genie that gives you all your wishes. The scientists could say, well, that's ridiculous. Obviously we can't get everything we want, therefore we don't have free will. So they make up a definition. They call that a straw man that they can easily trash later. So that's where that definition of free will came from. It's not a genie with unlimited wishes. Free will is simply the ability to make a choice among those possibilities that you are aware of, your consciousness, and you're aware that you could make a choice between A and B and C. Well, then you have that free will means you can make that choice between A and B and C. Now, you may actually also be able to choose D, E, F, and Y and Z, but you're not aware of that. Your awareness only sees A, B, and C. Your free will is just your ability to choose between A, B, and C, because that's all you're aware of. So free will is just your ability to freely choose those things that are inside your own decision space. That's the A, B, and C in this case, is in your decision space. So that's all free will is. Now, that's a very logical description of free will. Your freedom to make the choices of the things that are inside your own decision space. All right, so given that free will, then free will obviously has to exist if you're conscious. Consciousness makes choices, so you need free will for the choices. But what's the scientist said is these things are all illusions. You know, that somehow the brain makes consciousness, and then all the things that consciousness does are just illusions. And that doesn't really make any sense. Who's having the illusion? What's having the illusion? Oh, consciousness is having the illusion. No, consciousness doesn't exist. You see, consciousness doesn't exist. These are just illusions. Oh, the brain is having the illusion. It's the brain having an illusion. That's silly. That's not what we experience. You know, physicists make up their physics based on observation of the real world. They do experiments and observe the results. That is discounting our observation of the real world. So here they're making an exception that, you know, we observe the real world and then we understand how the world works because of it. And now they're saying, oh, you can't trust the real world, throw it out because it's all an illusion. Well, that's really not a good thing for scientists to do, but they only do it because they have their backs against the wall. They have to be logically consistent, say that free will and consciousness and time don't exist. Now, with time, what they do is they say, oh, well, here's the answer for time. Here's how time is an illusion. They say that really there's just all these static frames of determinist thing. By determinist, that's when I say static, right? It's all determined. So you have all these frames. Think of them like the frames in a movie. You know, a movie is just made by a bunch of frames, which are all still shots. And you just go through these still shots very quickly. First you show this one, then the next one, and the next one. And it looks like people are moving, but they're not really moving. It's just an illusion of motion on the screen because you're showing a whole bunch of stills with little changes in the stills, so it looks like motion. So that's the illusion of time. So we look at a movie, and in that movie, we can see 10 years worth of action going on there, but it's only 2 hours in our theater. It's just an illusion of time. Well, they say that's how it works here, that our world is really created of these deterministic planes, these deterministic possibilities. And we just skip between them. We go to this one, to that one, and the next one. And that's what creates the illusion of time. And that's exactly what Bernardo said, which is what the physicists said. And some gurus said that too, because, you know, that's, you know, it's hard to argue with physicists, right? They're supposed to know. So if they say that's how time's an illusion, then everybody who's not a physicist says, well, that must be true because those physicists don't lie to us. But those physicists do sometimes struggle when they have their backs against the wall with being logical. So that is is the idea. But now, what is skipping? What do you mean you skip from this deterministic to that deterministic to the next deterministic? What do you mean you skip from frame to frame to frame? And that creates time. In order to skip, you need time, right? You can't skip without time. Now I'm here in this frame. Now next time in that frame. And after that, I'm in the next frame. You have to have time to skip. So what they're really saying is that if you decide that time is a real thing, then you can show how time is just an illusion. But first, you have to have the assumption that time exists. And if I have that assumption, okay, time exists, now I can show you that time is an illusion, because now with time existing, I can skip from deterministic frame to deterministic frame to deterministic frame and create the illusion of time. You know, well, that is what's called logically inconsistent. It's a failure of logic. So yes, determinists show that time is an illusion, but in order to show time is an illusion, first, they have to assume that time exists in order to do that. So it's a bad argument that we skip from deterministic frame to deterministic frame, and that is the illusion of time. And basically, that is what Bernardo said. He says, well, it's skipping from frame to frame. And
But
of
that's
course,
a
that
materialist viewpoint, and he's
right.
not a materialist.
No, but somehow he picked that up and did not
Right.
make that association that that was part of that awful materialism that he doesn't like. But
Right.
that's basically the materialists had to discount free will. And they did that by making free will something ridiculous like a genie with infinite wishes. And they had to discount time. And when you discount time, they made that into skipping from deterministic thing to deterministic thing, and never really saying anything about how one can skip without time.
Well, now, Tom, your experiments are going to show what the original double slit experiment showed.
What I hope to show in my experiments is that the observer is indeed critical to the experiment, because that is what the group of physicists who really started quantum mechanics, Bohr, the Copenhagen group that had the Copenhagen interpretation, as they call it. It really wasn't an interpretation. That group in Copenhagen said, this is what our experiments show us. Mm-hmm. Later, that was called an interpretation, but it's what their experiments showed them. And now we've gotten away from that. Copenhagen group, which is, goodness, all the big names, Heisenberg and Bohr, Niels Bohr, and well, even Einstein was there, although he didn't like it. He didn't like God playing with dice. He thought that was not a good idea. That was his metaphor. But it turned out he was wrong, that it is based on probability. It's not a bottoms-up model. It's a probability top-down model. But anyhow, that group of people, Schrodinger, Planck, all of them came to the conclusion that the observer, that the information had to come into this reality, this what we call the physical universe. If the information didn't come into this physical reality, then you got an interference pattern. If it does come into this reality and you know the which way data, that's which slit did the particle go through, then you don't get an interference pattern. Okay, so that was what they said, that it depended on an observer. Well, it really wasn't that a human had to look at it. It's just that the information had to be in the physical reality such that a person could look at it. So it's not really that eyeballs had to be staring at it. It's just that a person could look at that information. And that fits perfectly with my theory as a virtual reality. A virtual reality exists only in the minds of the players. And if the information does not come into a mind of a player, then it can't get into the virtual reality, because the virtual reality exists only in the minds of the players. So I see the world the same way the Copenhagen folks did, the same way that the Copenhagen interpretation saw reality from their experiments. Meanwhile, physics has moved on because they didn't like that, because that made consciousness important. Consciousness, being able to see it, was a fact to them. And the materialists said, we're stuck here with consciousness. What can we do to get rid of it? Because they didn't like it, because they didn't know how to explain it. They had no theories for it. They weren't able to somehow bring it into physics. It was this outside thing that didn't fit. So they made stuff up, like, free will is a genie that gives you, infinite things. So, obviously there's no free will. And that consciousness is just some kind of a epiphenomena of the brain. And trying to explain how that works is what they call the hard problem. And the reason it's so hard is because it isn't true. It doesn't work that way.
So outside is the key word. They knew that this was something outside of this reality, which then coincides with your theory as well. They just couldn't define they couldn't have the context for which to understand what this thing outside of reality is that consciousness is fundamental
Right, right.
really meant. Is that right?
Right. They didn't have that. They couldn't come up with a theory. So if you're a scientist and you just come up with a blank trying to explain something, then what you do is you try to take that thing that is causing you that trouble and you deny that it's really like that. So that's what quantum physics did. They said, oh, no, consciousness isn't important. It has nothing to do with consciousness. It's some other, it has to do with information can never be destroyed, and that information always exists within particles and things. Even if consciousness doesn't have it, it's there just the same. And as long as it's there, that works. So that made reality a machine again, a materialistic machine, and got rid of their consciousness problem. And my experiment is to show that that's not the case, that it really requires an observer.
They're still calling quantum mechanics weird, and quantum mechanics and relativity are at odds with each other, which then your theory of consciousness unites and simplifies.
It does. That is true.
And also your theory, I'm sorry, also your theory recognizes that the reality that we live in is a social system. And this social system needs to evolve, has a purpose. It is more consistent and more logical than no purpose and not consciousness at the root of reality.
Yeah. Well, the purpose is the same as what we already discussed, the purpose of consciousness. The purpose is to evolve by lowering the entropy of the system. You lower entropy by creating structure, by creating things out of randomness. You lower entropy through creating information, creating things. Things are just really information. So yes, that's our purpose too. We're a piece of this. So in a social system, the way you minimize entropy, the way you lower entropy in a social system is by cooperating and caring. You see, if you are very self-centered in a social system, you create entropy. If you're very self-centered, then you don't have trust. If you don't have trust, then it's hard to have, economic systems. It's hard to grow. It's hard. You don't share everything. Everybody's out for just them. And that doesn't evolve very far. That's a very limited system. Whereas if everybody is caring, everybody's sharing, everybody's helping each other, well, that system is basically unlimited. It's only limited by the resources it has to work with. The other system is very limited. So in any case, yes, we're here and we have purpose. Consciousness has purpose. That's one of the attributes of consciousness. If it doesn't have purpose, it's not consciousness. So, the way scientists, the way materialists have dealt with this is they define consciousness or they define free will in a way that makes it silly and easy to get rid of, easy to throw away. The same thing they do with consciousness. Consciousness doesn't exist. It's just something that the physical brain creates for a reason that nobody would understand, for purposes that that nobody understands. So it's this big mystery, but it has to happen because otherwise it would ruin materialism. You couldn't be a materialist and still be.
I don't think that would be such logical. A bad thing. I think that having purpose, learning and evolving and knowing that we're here to care about others is something that would be quite needed right now.
Yes, you would think so. But if you're a materialist, then reality is a machine with rules. That's it. You can't have a machine that cares. You can't have a machine that is empathetic. You can't have a machine that really has any sense of right from wrong, good from bad. Machines just do what they do. You have this input and it just crunches through however it crunches. They operate just because the physical laws say this is what they have to do. So that is the problem. You see, when we're materialists, we see the impossibility of empathy, of caring, of love. We don't see the necessity of sharing and helping each other. All we see is there's this big machine and everybody's out for themselves to get what they can get and take whatever they take to make sure that their lives and the lives of those that are close to them are as good as possible. And everybody is in this big system, this big machine, and we make as much out of it as we can. So it's this whole idea of materialism that has led us to this very bankrupt attitude about life, about about people. This thing about big corporations, all they do is make profit. They've got no sense of cooperating and being part of a successful society. They just make money. To hell with the society and people, you know. We take the idea of evolution, of physical evolution, where the survival of the fittest, and then they apply that to society and say, well, it's just a big jungle. This is survival of the fittest. So yeah, I steal from you. I run over you. I take your stuff. I set up rules and laws and stuff that allows me to take advantage of you because I have power and you don't, because I'm more fit than you are. That's why you're on the bottom and I'm on the top. So the idea of materialism, you see, kind of feeds this idea of the machine, and a machine is uncaring. A machine doesn't have any values, right? It has only rules that makes it do what it do. And we take this idea of materialism and it supports all of the dysfunction that we see. So if we got to the point, you know, we were talking about the larger conscious system does things to pry open people's minds, to pry open their senses. Well, that's because they're trying to pry them open to the point that love is important, caring, cooperation, sharing, caring about other people, not being self-centered, that all these things are crucially important. And as long as you live in a materialist world, they not only aren't important, they don't exist. They don't exist.
I don't think we have much evidence of that from what I've seen, the reactions of people, their experiences, their subjective experiences. Like you were saying at one point, the subjective experience, what really matters is what we feel, how we care about each other. And I think there are more people like that in this world. When you say people at the top grabbing everything that they can, I don't think that people see that as any kind of ideal. And I think there's so much evidence to the contrary that people are loving and caring.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. If you want evidence to the contrary, just, you know, dial up the news tonight and see all the dysfunction in the world. If you want to see evidence to the contrary, when people evolve the quality of their consciousness and care about other people, when it's about others, not about self, your life becomes very positive, you know, very good, very peaceful, full of love and caring and joy. And you don't let the ugliness upset you. Ugliness is just there because people haven't grown up yet. They haven't learned. But that's, you know, the connection, there is a connection between materialism and kind of the bankrupt attitudes we have about our purpose, you know, about what we're here for and how we relate to other people. That everything, you know, again, if you're a materialist, then reality is a machine. Consciousness is just part of that machine. It's a machine that makes consciousness from the brain for some unknown reason, you know, for an unknown purpose. And it just is part of the machine. So that gives people kind of the rights to be rude, to be self-centered, to grab what they can grab. You know, if it's just a machine, then take what you can take.
Well, Tom, we get a lot of comments about how can the LCS, and this is your acronym for the larger consciousness system or the source, how can the LCS allow all of this ugliness? And that's where your free will comes in. Without that free will, without a choice, there's no learning.
Well, sure.
Can you condense that?
The larger consciousness system is not God playing with these pet people. Oh, pet people, you're doing it wrong. Here, let me stop that. Look, no, that's not right. you can't do that. That's a bad thing. You're going to hurt somebody. You have to stop. Well, that is not obviously free will. You can't say, okay, everybody has free will as long as you do what I want. That's not free will. The system has to let us figure it out on our own. We have free will. We get to make poor choices. We get to be self-centered. We get to hurt other people and grab other people's stuff. And we get to make laws and rules that favor us and that disadvantage other people. Okay, we can, all of that is allowable because we have free will. And then we have to live with it. We have to live in this place of dysfunction because that's what we get when we're dysfunctional and we do not come from a place of love and caring. Then we get a world that does not come from a place of love and caring, and we get to live in this mess. So it's all part of our learning. It's all part of the feedback, and the system doesn't come in and rearrange all the pieces on the board all the time to make them nice. That would ruin it as a learning lab. This is a schoolhouse. You can't learn anything if there's some big boss somewhere that tells you what to do. If you're basically a slave, you're not going to grow up much. So the system lets us do what we do, interact the way we do. And because being self-centered creates misery and being other-centered creates joy, then we're supposed to figure it out on our own, move toward the joy. Well, and we have been. If you look at mankind over the last 500 years or 1,000 years, you'll see that civilization has grown. It's gotten kinder, it's gotten gentler, it's gotten more caring. It's grown a lot, and it's going to continue to grow because that's evolution. So it's going to go that way no matter what, it's just that evolution can be very slow.
And there are steps forward and there are steps backward.
Sure.
And all of the ugliness in the world is something that we have to deal with in the most positive way possible.
Exactly.
People feel helpless, and their strength is their self, their love, and their joy. And when you see other people that are being hurt, you see that outpouring of love and caring, and you know that there are people that realize that that is our purpose.
Yeah, exactly. If this can be a very ugly place with a lot of nasty things and people abusing other people, people trying to grab things, people trying to dominate and control and manipulate others. But if you get angry at that, if that makes you angry, then you become part of the problem. Angry people is what creates the problem. You see, so how do you live in a place that's as rough as this place and still find joy and peace? Well, you just have to have a bigger picture. You have to get out of the little tiny picture. You're not trapped in a machine. You are in a place where people are being what they are. That's the level of consciousness evolution that they've attained. They are still very self-centered. They have a lot of fear. Fear, the self-centeredness comes out of fear. You wouldn't be self-centered if you weren't fearful. You're fearful about not getting yours and not getting enough and needing more. And all of that fear is what drives it. So we're very fearful. And fearful people act very badly for the most part. They create ego and it creates beliefs. So you look out in the world and all that dysfunction is because people are fearful and they're not evolved. Their consciousness has not evolved to the point where they could have gotten rid of that fear, where they can be kind and gentle. But they're doing whatever they have to do. They are at the point they are. That's the way it is with evolution. You just have to start from wherever you are and you grow from there. So everybody out there is basically doing the best they can with what they've got. And you have to look at it and say, oh, yeah, it's pretty dysfunctional. Yes, they're hurting and manipulating other people, but it's where they are. And those other people are struggling and getting angry and fussing and fighting, and all of that dysfunction is just an example of how we are, the state to which we have evolved. So you look at it, and instead of being angry about it, you have compassion for it. You look at it and say, wow, that's terrible that people choose to be that way. They could choose to be differently. And you try to be part of the solution to help people to choose to be differently. You try to always stay positive. And as soon as you go negative, you get angry, you get upset. How could those idiots do that? And we have these reactions to where our reactions are violent and manipulative, and we want to control everything. Well, that's the same thing that they're doing. They're manipulating and controlling and angry and pushy. So you don't solve the problem by being the problem. You have to solve the problem by not being the problem. You see? So you be positive. Always be positive. Yes, you recognize this is not a lovely place. Yes, there are a lot of fearful people. Have compassion for them. Don't be part of their problem. And find your own joy, your own peace, your own wonderful relationships and connections to people, your own sense of learning and growing and becoming. And let all that be your joy. And find happiness in that, even if you live in a world that's full of dysfunction. If you're positive, you can find joy in that world. The only reason you get drug into that nastiness and get angry and upset with it is because of your own fear. So let that fear go. Let all that negativity go. Be positive. You have consciousness, you have time, you have free will, you can grow. And if the other people are making poor choices, well, they'll just have to suffer the anguish, the anger, and the rest of it until they outgrow those choices. Yes, civilization has done reasonably well. We've grown a lot as a race, but not enough. It's still very dysfunctional. But we're working on it, and we'll do better. Because one of the things of good news is the more you grow, the easier it is to grow more. Evolution is slow, and it kind of goes, like you say, a couple of steps forward and a couple of steps backward. It's relentless. Evolution always chugs forward, even if it gets pushed back for a time. I mean, we could have some kind of big nuclear exchange that would force us backward to where we all kind of act like animals again, right? But eventually we chug our way out of that, get back to this and go on forward. Evolution is a relentless force, and that force is taking us toward a world of caring and sharing and sustainability, and a place that it is a very positive place for everybody, where everybody gets to act out, gets to achieve, gets to be as much as they can be. It's not a place where there are lots of rules that restrict you. As we grow up, the rules can disappear. A lot of the rules can go away. As we grow up, you get less and less rules because the people don't need rules to govern their behavior because they're more grown up. So freedom is what you get, and you get fewer rules, not more. And when everybody is trying to be positive for everybody else, then you have a optimal social situation with the lowest possible entropy. And basically everybody lives with joy and peace and happiness. Now, will we ever get there? I mean, is that just a goal to shoot for, like zero entropy? Well, probably we'll never get there in that sense, but can we get closer and closer to that? Yes, we can get closer and closer to that, and we're not that close to it now. We got a long way to go.
So I think that's a good advice, good compassion and caring at this particular time and moving forward. And will we get there? Well, only time will tell.
Yeah, well, we will get there, but when are we going to get there? Only time will tell.
Only time will tell. Thank you, Tom.
INMBT Events, hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this user-friendly, ad-free YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to do what we can. It's our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our newly created Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you.